contributing to the city of Boston. Additionally, we thank GSD professors Malkit Shoshan, Professor Dan Borelli, and our cohort of outstanding scholars, designers, and artists at the Harvard Graduate School of Design for all of their encouragement and support throughout this process. Additionally, we extend sincere gratitude to the Research Center for Contemporary Native American Art at the Institute of American Indian Arts, the Harvard University Native American Program for their technical assistance in making this event happen, and the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective, and most importantly, the Kaish Makers Fund for their gracious sponsorship support of this event. So that said, we'll go ahead and get started with our slide presentation. And bear with me just a moment. Okay. And also, just briefly, I'd like to mention that there are at least 2 slides in this presentation that may be uncomfortable for our audience, so please bear in mind. And so to begin, Reconfiguring Histories grew out of research that began in the fall of 2020, but in retrospect may truly be attributed to a spontaneous visit to the Harvard Peabody Museum while attending the Design Discovery Program at the GSD in 2012. On that day, I encountered a variety of kapa, or Native Hawaiian textiles, with a range of color, patterns, watermarks, and textures, of which I had previously limited or no idea existed. I was overwhelmed by the experience, but it told me a few things. One, the quality of these textiles were incredibly complex and beautiful, and were evidence of the highly skilled artisanal labor and cultivation methods of Kanaka Maoli, which ultimately countered any previous false notions of the lack of sophistication and intelligence of my people, something we as Indigenous people have always known to be true. Second, I questioned, how did these textiles end up at the Peabody, and why did these textiles reside in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a place so many miles from its place of origin? And finally, the third thought was, finding these cultural items somehow brought comfort to me, because in a way, the labor and mana, or spirit, of my ancestors was embedded within these materials and was within close proximity. Those items and the history associated had haunted me since, and has since guided me in pursuing this work. And as we know, the spoils of colonial plunder and the acquisition of material culture and the lands and people it served to dispossess are now housed within museum collections nationally and internationally. Quite often, material culture obtained from the colonized by the colonizer was often accomplished through violence and without the consent of respective community members. Early methods of material dispossession predominantly objectified the people it purported to research and study, thereby solidifying Western imposed interpretations and narratives of colonized people. As a result, dignified and accurate representations of Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been absent from institutions and through mainstream society. This is apparent in exhibition spaces, collections, and throughout archival data sets that create the framework for which cultures are understood. In February 2021, Harvard President Larry Bacow published an apology letter recognizing Harvard's role in unethical collection practices that placed academic enterprise above respect for the dead and human decency. Backhow's apology falls in line with numerous similar responses to mounting pressure to address Harvard's role in this nation's colonial project. As a leading academic and research institution, I believe Harvard plays a significant role in spearheading efforts to support museum and data collection practices that distance itself from Harvard's entanglement with racism and the colonial project. Throughout this period, I became particularly interested in the data sets utilized by museums, which from my perspective offered a limited, sometimes inaccurate, and in some cases were entirely absent of provenance. The limited lens for which these data collection processes operate also contribute to the overall knowing, understanding, and care the public share for history and culture. While exhibitions make history and cultures visible, the data sets control access to truly understanding the mundane temporal human experience through everyday objects. What might it mean to think dignity through things, to consider the diverse ingenuity of alternate indigenous ontologies and epistemologies in relation to museum collections? From this, I ask, how can we begin to challenge colonialist systems and propose new ideas that further augment provenance to include non-linear and non-Western based knowledge and value systems? So Divya and I have gathered today not as experts in the field, but as concerned counterparts whose lives are shaped by this history. We hope to initiate a different kind of thinking about others through the plurality of ways and being in the world. In this light, we hope that museums might consider moving beyond the preservation of things and think about themselves as being caring for people. As participants in a critical discussion, let us be open to the discomfort that may arise, but let us also provide a framework where participants are comfortable enough to answer questions and the consideration of creating more equitable futures. And now I invite my research partner and fellow GSD classmate, Divya Saraf, to introduce her work.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the COVID crisis in India right now. I know many of you are joining us from there. I hope you and your loved ones are safe. South Asian student organizations across the United States, including at the Harvard Business School, Kennedy School, and at the GSD, have collaborated to set up a fundraiser for assisting COVID relief work in India. I'll add the link to the chat if you'd like to contribute. I'd like to share some of my work through which I approach the topics we're having conversations about today. To begin with, one of my research projects investigates the colonial dimensions, both past and present, of a series of paintings which emerged in the 18th and 19th century India, known as company paintings. These paintings were commissioned by European patrons, primarily the British East India Company, hence the name company paintings, and are a result of British attempts to survey, record, and display Indian culture for its citizens. As such, the paintings have been instrumental in shaping public perceptions of India abroad. The subject matter of the paintings range from India's flora and fauna to buildings, social scenes, people, and even cultural practices unique to India. Most notably, and especially popular at the time, are paintings depicting people of different trades in their everyday attire, described at the time as their costumes. The paintings even became collector's items and were typically put out in various series and collected in albums. It is important to note that the company painting style is itself hybrid, a realistic or naturalistic Western draftsman wash technique, as assimilated by Indian painters, many of whom were originally trained in the Mughal miniature tradition. Today, these paintings are displayed around the world in renowned institutions such as the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and the Indian Museum in Calcutta. Heidi, slide, please. I have been studying the effects of imperialism on culture and how practices of image making work hand in hand with empire building, using these paintings as my case study. I focused on the role of the image in the construction of the Indian native as a subject type. As such, the images portrayed in the company paintings are intimately linked to the efforts of the British Empire to control and administer the Indian subcontinent. To know the native was to possess and own them, which allowed the colonizer to control and manipulate the identity of the colonized in the service of empire. What stands out in these paintings is the decontextualization of people, places, flora, and fauna represented. The subjects are abstracted, often standing alone on blank pieces of paper, dispossessed of social context, and thereby of meaning. Most significant is that the names and details of the artists of these paintings are largely unknown. The erasure of the names of company painting artists is itself indicative that their identities were not viewed as relevant to the imperial project, which is a form of epistemic violence. Through my research, I seek to offer an alternative ground, or what Spivak calls a determination otherwise, for our understanding of these paintings and the specific ways in museums and archives continue to exploit them through a legacy of epistemic violence. My analysis is informed by three main concepts. The first is epistemic violence from Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. The second is Homi Bhabha's concept of hybridity. And the third is Fanon's concept of dual consciousness. Since our conversations today is focused on the contemporary, I'm going to focus on the colonial legacy of these paintings and institutions today. So far, my research has been focused on the Met in New York, the Victoria and Albert and Wallace collections in London, and Victoria Memorial Hall and Indian Museum in Calcutta. So for example, here you see the 18 paintings that were part of an exhibition at the Met in 2017. Of these 18 paintings, slide please. Only 2 of the paintings artists were known and 3 were associated. The Met makes available details on these exhibition labels, though very little on the origin and provenance of these works, but often with misleading language. Slide, please. For example, this label from the same exhibition of a painting of the Bara Imambara complex reads the second sentence, "It is a valuable historical record of several parts of the site which were demolished during the Indian uprising of 1857. This vague sentence hardly makes it clear that it was in fact destroyed by the British after they violently crushed the rebellion. In line with the colonial taxonomical logic of the company paintings, the British surveyed and photographed the complex just before leveling it with explosives. It is important to expand our archives by including contemporary artists challenging the third space that is present-day India. One particularly provocative example is the work of Pushpamala N., who recreates anthropological photography and video to undermine the persisting dual consciousness of British colonial narratives today. Her work, along with other artists such as Anoli Pereira, challenged the ongoing hegemony of colonial narratives in South Asian identity formation as means of taking back agency. I'm developing ways to pluralize narratives and include multiple perspectives. One such method includes hosting a series of collage events in which, through collaging and layering with prints and stamps, participants are invited to challenge the implicit colonial narratives in the paintings as means of developing new forms of self-identity. Through collage, the paintings are transformed by the makers, revealing the entanglements of personhood that these paintings obliterate. Apart from looking at image-making practices, I've also worked on material histories of artifacts with a focus on the labor history of the indigo production in India and in finding ways to make visible, slide please, the invisible material histories embedded within museum collections. Slide please. To end, I believe that in order for us to imagine different futures, we need to critically imagine our histories. As long as art functions as a means of revealing the diversity of human potentials to ourselves, it too must be subject to this form of critique. And so Heidi and my research with specific collections led us to think about these issues on an institutional level, which has grown into a series of projects, of which the symposium is the first. It will also be accompanied by a report, slide please, which will be ready towards the end of May, that will bring together reflections from our conversations today. We will be having an open call, so please reach out if you'd like to submit your work and be included in this publication. Slide, please. I thank you again for joining us today, and I'm now going to move on to introduce our panelists for our first panel. Karen Kramer is Curator of Native American and Oceanic Art and Culture at the Peabody Essex Museum. Her longstanding commitment to innovative approaches to Indigenous art and culture and her broad experiences working with Native artists, scholars, communities, and other stakeholders helped shape the museum's ambitious program, including the growth of its collection, its sensitive presentation, and its ongoing interpretation and preservation. Over the past 25 years, Karen has helped produce more than 10 major exhibitions on Native American art and culture at the museum, including the most recent nationally traveling groundbreaking exhibition, TC Canon at the Edge of America. Karen Kramer directs the Peabody Essex Museum's innovative Native American Fellowship Program and has served as president, vice president, and board member for the Native American Art Studies Association. She earned her MA in anthropology from George Washington University and is currently a doctoral student in American Studies at Harvard University. Shumana Chakraborty is the founder of Hamdasti, a Kolkata-based arts platform for socially engaged art practices. Her work is participatory in nature, engaging diverse communities over a long period of time and collaboratively intervening in public spaces. Shumona is a graduate of the Shrishti School of Art, Design and Technology, Bangalore, with a master's degree from the Graduate School of Design here at Harvard University. She has been a fellow at the Art Think South Asia program at Khoj in Delhi and at Global Cultural Leaders program hosted by the European Union. She is currently the Deputy Director of the Khore Baire DAG Museums at the Currency Building in Kolkata. Castle McLaughlin is a social anthropologist and curator of North American anthropology at the Peabody Museum here at Harvard, where she practices and promotes collaborative engagement and exhibition development with Native American communities and contributes to the museum's development of ethical stewardship. She has also worked with Native and settler ranching communities in the Dakotas, conducted wild horse research for the National Park Service, and was the co-founder and long-term vice president of the Lakota Horse Conservancy. She's the author of Art of Diplomacy, Lewis and Clark's Indian Collection, and a Lakota war book from The Little Big Horn, the pictographic autobiography of Half Moon, both based on collaborative projects and exhibits centered on Peabody Collections. Diana Di Paolo Loren is Senior Curator at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology here at Harvard University. Loren is an anthropological archaeologist specializing in colonial New England, museums, representation, health, dress, and adornment. She co-directs the Archaeology of Harvard Yard project with Patricia Capone. Loren is the author of The Archaeology of Clothing and Bodily Adornment in Colonial America. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before I hand it over to Karen, I just wanted to point out that we will have time for questions at the end of this panel. So please use the Q&A to submit any thoughts and questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna just share my screen here, always an adventure, and then we'll get started. Okay, PowerPoint. Good to go. Hold on here. Okay. I want to start by thanking Divya and Heidi for asking me to join this three-part Reconfiguring Histories panel. Their incredibly thoughtful brainchild that is connected to a larger series of panels that they've hosted. Thanks also to the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective and the Harvard Design School. It is an honor to be in community with you all, including with my esteemed panelists, my new colleague, Shumona, and my longtime colleagues, Castle and Diana. And my heart is especially with Divya and Shimona today, who are in India, and I wish safety for them and their families and communities writ large in the midst of this COVID crisis. And I greet you all from ancestral Pawtucket and Massachusetts territory, and begin by acknowledging my position as a non-native scholar and curator living and working as an uninvited settler on occupied Indigenous land. And I recognize my responsibilities to the land here and to the people who came before me. That Native art is living and breathing and a visual manifestation of hundreds of generations of careful cultivation of and by Indigenous people, and their values guides my work as I move through these museum and university spaces. Heidi and Divya have asked me to share some case studies of my work at the Peabody Essex Museum that shines a light on decolonial praxis and community engagement. And I should say from the outset that I never set out to decolonize the museum per se, though now that there is more language, theory, and movement on the ground that allows us to talk about dismantling these insidious colonial structures and systems, I realize that I've been working to do so for about 2.5 decades. Decolonization in a museum setting is, of course, an incompletable but honorable pursuit, in part because museums are at their very core colonial institutions. And what I find to be perhaps a more useful framework is the idea of presencing indigeneity, an approach that influences museum programs, exhibitions, hiring practices, administrative policies, and more. And to me, it means decentering whiteness and infusing the institution with Indigenous perspectives through art, interpretation, and scholarship. And though my work focuses largely on Indigenous art and culture, these approaches should also extend to all BIPOC communities. And my work has long aimed to incite and invite change in the perception of Native art and culture, and to build bridges between Indigenous art and artists, often left out of the conversation, and mainstream museum audiences. So in my current role, I constantly assess the lines of accountability and authority between the museum and Native communities of artists, scholars, curators, educators, and representatives. But in order to show you where I'm at, I have to show you where I've come from. So that is where I begin. And I have to be quick because I only have 20 minutes total. So since the Peabody Essex Museum's inception in 1799, we have collected, displayed, and interpreted Native art in a variety of ways, each rooted in the conscious and unconscious attitudes of their era. Our Native collection encompasses over 10,000 years of human creativity in the Americas. The majority of the collection is 19th century to the present from what is now the United States and Canada. The Peabody Essex Museum has the oldest ongoing collection of Native American art in the Western Hemisphere, which is world-renowned for its outstanding aesthetic quality, condition, provenance, and range of time periods, media, and geography. Members of the East India Marine Society, the museum's founding institution, collected most of the earliest Native American acquisitions. Society members were global entrepreneurs, sea captains, and traders who collected natural and artificial curiosities and formed a museum in Salem, Massachusetts, displaying them in that context, reflecting so-called Enlightenment sensibilities and emerging American nationalism. Explorers, missionaries, and anthropologists continued to grow the collection throughout the 19th century. And by the turn of the 20th century, the museum turned more toward science and ethnology, which is evident here in these two images in the Ethnology collection on display that stayed relatively untouched throughout much of the 20th century, though there were increasing efforts to include cultural context and aesthetic considerations. And it wasn't until the 1990s that the museum broke free from prior historical orientation and began to emphasize in new ways our collection's depth, breadth, and the cross-cultural interrelationships that connect creativity, innovation, and art to the world in which it is made. Under leadership of our former executive director and CEO, Dan Monroe, the museum began embarking on a complete philosophical overhaul of the institution. And NAGPRO was still fairly new at the time, and again, under Dan's leadership, we carried his vision and NAGPRO's spirit of collaboration into our exhibition plan by proactively committing ourselves to working with contemporary Native artists and scholars, and we began collecting and presenting contemporary Native artworks. In 1996, we announced these fundamental changes with the traveling exhibition, Gifts of the Spirit, and its companion catalog. The exhibition had 5 co-curators. We had 3 guest co-curators, including Suzanne Schoen Harjo, who is Cheyenne and Hadolji Muskogee, Rick Hill, who's Tuscarora, and Dick Kahn of the Denver Art Museum, as well as our director, Dan Monroe, and our former curator of Native American art, John Grimes, who are all here in that picture on the lower right with Choctaw artist Marcus Ammerman. This show is our first endeavor to display contemporary Native objects as art rather than artifact. Historic and contemporary artworks were integrated thematically, emphasizing cultural and artistic connections. The emphasis was on the artist and the art first and foremost in labels, design, and interpretation. Artworks were displayed in individual vitrines rather than grouped en masse as in former ethnology displays. Video footage of contemporary artists and artist statements were incorporated into labels and computer kiosks. And this show is actually my first job at the Peabody Essex Museum. This was my training. And then in 2003, the museum reopened after a multi-year expansion and renovation project, and Native American art had its own gallery. And then from there, we really started rolling with even more with Native American art. We received 10 years of funding through the Education through Cultural and Historical Organizations grant, which was a subsection of the No Child Left Behind Act. And that allowed us to do a lot of cultural exchange and collection sharing with institutions and communities in Alaska and Hawaii. And in between 2004 and 5, the Peabody Essex Museum and the governments of Canada and Nunavut put together a collaborative traveling exhibition, which was called Our Land, Contemporary Art from the Arctic. And this celebrated the growth of Inuit creative expression over the past 5 decades. We worked directly with Inuit elders, artists, writers, and other community members on the show and incorporated their perspectives in the interpretive labels and text panels, which were provided in both English and Inuktitut, the Inuit language that is strikingly graphic, as you can see here, in its design and composition. A likeness of the Northern Lights appeared on the vaulted ceilings, giving the galleries an unexpected atmospheric ambiance. And we displayed as many objects as we could without plexiglass bonnets whenever possible, helping visitors with the perceived increased accessibility of the material. And in 2010, we launched the Native American Fellowship Program, because we believe that fostering and advancing the next generation of Native American leaders in the cultural heritage sector is an institutional responsibility, in addition to caring for, presenting, and interpreting Native art in innovative ways. Putting on exhibitions, hosting programs, writing catalogs is important, but that is not the only responsibility that we have to our Native stakeholders whose work we house in the collection. So now in the 12th year of operation, the overarching goals of our fellowship program are to increase specific professional experience and skills, to address leadership capacity, and for our fellows to gain practical work experience and knowledge of management, fundraising, and communication models necessary for these future leaders in the cultural heritage sector. And equally as important to the success of the program are structured opportunities to build a professional network grounded in career-long mentorship. And funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in 2016 allowed for expansion of our 10-week summer program, the creation of longer-term positions, and a more robust program for our alumni. We have 51 amazing alumni in our program. Housing, travel costs to and from the Peabody Essex Museum, and stipends are offered for each year for our summer fellows. And I run the program with Jennifer Himmelreich, a program alumni, and we often tell our fellows that we try to create a safe space for them to thrive and fail forward. In 2012, we mounted an exhibition that I curated called Shapeshifting Transformations in Native American Art. And this show aimed to broaden and deepen people's understanding of Native art and culture, to counter stereotypes and preconceived notions of what Native American art is and what it can be, to celebrate diversity while avoiding essentialization, and to move away from the anthropological, to move away from the Native object as specimen, to move away from craft, and to move away from Native art conceived of as just tourist trinkets. And the premise of this show really offered an exciting new orientation for understanding Native creativity and art making as part of a dynamic, evolving continuum. And Shapeshifting countered these notions that I was just talking about, and kind of removed Native art from the past and presented it as something very contemporary, even when looking at objects from the past. It integrated historical with contemporary works, and it anchored them through ideas that explore links and continuities between the past and the present, through 4 themes that looked at change and artistic innovation, worldview, politics and place, and how individual artists express themselves in relation to the changing world around them. We worked with a large group of advisors, including our fellows, which you can see in the picture on the right. And we worked with artists who were talking about their own work, whether in the past, as with Jonathan Perry, Aquina Wampanoag, looking at an ancestor's work club, or K-Walking Stick on the top. And we also really ended the exhibition with this piece, monumental installation by Brian Jungen, to kind of encourage our visitors again to be thinking about what does Native art do, and what does it look like, and to try to again sort of shake up these preconceived notions. In 2015, I curated this traveling exhibition, Native Fashion Now. I hope some of you had a chance to see it, and perhaps have the companion catalog. But this was a real joy to pull together. And it was an exhibition that included 75 works by contemporary Native fashion designers and artists, and included the work by 71 living Native designers and artists. And it ranged from streetwear to avant-garde haute couture. And again, I collaborated with our Native American fellows who helped me think through objects, who helped me think through thematic ideas, who helped with the interpretation. And we also had a group of fashion scholars and designers. And here are just a couple of pictures of objects in the show. And my most recent project was this T.C. Cannon show at the Edge of America, which celebrated the stunning life and art of T.C. Cannon, a contemporary Kiowa and Caddo painter, poet, and musician who came of age in the 1960s and 70s. He was a Vietnam veteran. He died tragically at the age of 31. And he is one of the most inventive And until this exhibition went largely unrecognized by the mainstream audience. But he was one of the most inventive artists in 20th century America. And so Cannon's work showed us how Native people represent themselves as persisting and flourishing in the face of oppression, a perspective that was largely previously absent from American history and art history. And Cannon, through his work, urges us to grapple with the legacies of colonization and the contradictions and questions of history and our place in it. And building a more connected community through interpretive text, through dramatic media pieces, and through interactive gallery activities really follows his lead. And by presenting his work as more than just painterly in an art historical context, we encouraged our audiences to gain a deeper, more nuanced understanding of Cannon as an amazingly complex, thoughtful human and artist, of course, with rich life experiences that informed his vision and voice. So here's one example of how we tried to do that. Part of our label experience here asked the question, imagine Cannon's portraits can speak. What would they say to you? And we had sketchbooks nearby whereby visitors could add their answers to these questions, as well as do some sketching, write some poetry, share any thoughts they had on the gallery experience. And so one person answered that question by saying, in the age of technology, where change occurs in the blink of an eye, humanity forgets that 1890 was only yesterday. How do you manage an identity that carries the weight of all my forefathers' mistakes? This land is your land. So this is an example of an empathetic, reflexive response that's inspired directly by Cannon's art and life, and the kind of engagement that we were hoping to do through the interpretive elements of the show. And nearly 20 fellows served as exhibition advisors on this project's content and intent. We also commissioned 4 new sets of poems by highly respected Native poets for the publication, and 2 new songs in response to his work by Choctaw singer-songwriter Samantha Crane for the exhibition, which extended his legacy, which still blazes strongly. So I'm wrapping this up soon. So what is next? Is happening in December of this year, and we will be showcasing our fantastic collections of Native American and American art. 2 portions of the collection that have been historically separated at our institution, and this will be a watershed moment in our history and the museum field because of how we are installing these objects and the deep conversations we hope to raise. We are mounting a robust and integrated presentation of these 2 collections that can advance new ways of seeing and thinking about art in this place we now call America. We have held a convening between Native and non-Native scholars, artists, and educators to think collaboratively as a group about ways to integrate this installation. And we also discussed how to augment and amplify historical complexities and artistic intersections. We've also held conversations with our summer fellows in workshops over 2 summers to dig deeper into what America and American art means to them in order to better understand and articulate shared goals for the gallery going forward. We have selected about 250 artworks that span in time over 10,000 years to today and demonstrate a range of voices, modes of expression, cultures, and media. Works will not be presented chronologically, and instead we will be exploring ideas and themes that link continuities and disjunctions between historical and contemporary objects across the Native and American art collections. And we will really be looking at notions of belonging to place and community, these are the overarching themes for the entire installation. And we will begin the exhibition experience with these two artworks that explore the myths and realities of the founding of America in coastal Massachusetts. Well, I should say that there's actually a larger constellation of objects, and this is two of them. This is a pair of artwork that depict the imagined landing of the English pilgrims in Plymouth in this fireboard on the left from 1825, which will be paired with a 1947 abstract landscape of Pilgrim Point in Provincetown, Massachusetts by Carl Kanaths. And these paintings represent iconic places where pilgrims landed in the place of the Wampanoag people who had sustained the land for millennia. American artists have mythologized and contemplated these places and interactions ever since. And speaking to these two works of art will be many of Will Wilson's recent portraits of Aquina Wampanoag community members, as well as Mashpee and Herring Pond community members who remain in their ancestral lands today, despite centuries of colonization that continue. Including contemporary Wampanoag voices is an unprecedented opportunity for the public to see the indigenous side of America's founding. And through these portraits and an augmented reality component, this body of work will celebrate the resilience of Wampanoag communities. And later in the installation will be a section that we're calling Generations, where our collections come together again to look at family and the importance of generational connections across cultures. Seneca Nation artist Marie Watt's companion species, Cosmos, Sunrise, and Flint, will hold center court in the section and will include a media component with footage from our community sewing circles, artist interviews, poetry, and music that inspired Marie. And overall, we hope that the stories that we surface in this groundbreaking collaboration between these two collections will help lead to a more connected, informed, and empathetic future for us all. And as I wrap this up, and thank you for your patience, I want to emphasize that my work would not be possible without institutional support, and that includes our donors, but it also wouldn't be possible without the relationships that I have built and that I'm building in Indian country. There were years that our fellowship program did not have grant funding, and Dan Monroe committed operational funds to run it anyways. And another example is that shape-shifting exhibition. We did not have a partner organization for traveling the show, which can sometimes offset the costs of associated with mounting an exhibition and doing a publication of this size, but we did it anyways. Having institutional buy-in from the top down, as well as bottom up and inside out, it is essential. And even then, it doesn't mean that it's easy to do this work, and that our work to presence indigeneity within this institution is done, but having that institutional buy-in is truly, it's truly essential. And so with that, I will conclude, and I will look forward to everybody else's presentations and to some generative discussion after. Thank you so much. I think that I will stop sharing now.
Shumona, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shumona. As Divya mentioned, I graduated from the GSD. That was about in 2013. And since then, I've been working in Calcutta in India, or Kolkata in India, in the eastern part of the country. I perhaps, I perhaps am much newer to the museum sector, so to speak, than a lot of my esteemed panelists. But over the last 6 years, I've been setting up and working with a group of artists as a part of a community-based arts organization called Hamdasti. So perhaps a bit of this presentation is to think about how somebody who works in socially engaged community practices moves to a museum space, and what lessons I try to bring from my 4 or 5 years of practice into a museum space. So if I look back, right at the start of this journey after I graduated, was one of the first projects that we started was this project called the Pop-Up Museum in a neighborhood in Calcutta called Chitpur. So it's actually a funny trajectory and somewhat a full circle moment for me, I guess, to reflect back on that first project, that first experiment where we really were learning on the go, and really perhaps didn't know what we were up to. But so here it is. It's the pop-up museum. As you can see, it was a kind of makeshift structure that was set up. It was a cul-de-sac, so it was a kind of dead end. And we used the architecture of these old houses that formed this kind of nook at the dead end to install these bamboo structures, which were made locally by craftspeople in the neighborhood. That was a kind of local craft that was available and historic to that neighborhood. And the museum is populated with kind of a random collection of objects from people in the neighborhood, living, working, and studying in the neighborhood, who contributed objects that they thought should belong to a museum that represented their neighborhood. The area that we're working in, sorry, the text has gone below the frame. The area that we're working in is Chitpur. Just to give you a sense of the neighborhood and why we chose it, it's really a place where it's kind of like a microcosm of the entire city. So it's a place where the rich and the poor, people across different castes and communities come together and have been living together for over 200 years. And as you can see, there are these, very grand mansions, but also the bazaars and the craft studios and the marketplaces that populate the streets. And this kind of mix of different cultures, identities, communities, something that drew us to the place, but also because this neighborhood had a history of public performances, art in people's homes, performances in courtyards. So we were really attracted to this idea that of art being a part of people's everyday lives and lives in communities. So which is what drew us to this area. And the primary collaborators in this project for us as artists were these students. They're boys from a government school, Bengali medium government school in the area, and none of them had ever been to a museum before. But they are the ones who went around the neighborhood collecting these stories, collecting objects, convincing people to submit stories and objects for this museum. And the museum, in a way, became a framework or a space that we created, which enabled different people to come and populate with their own narratives, their own perspectives, and their own histories, and sometimes multiple histories that sometimes even conflicted with each other. And that's something I think we've been doing a lot in all our work over the past 6 years, where each of us as artists look at our role as people who build these frameworks that allow for people to come in and occupy them and take over the space and make something of their own out of it. So the museum became this first framework for that, and that's something I think stuck in my head. And my idea of what a museum should be was very much shaped by this idea of a museum as a framework for engagement. Within this framework, what we hoped would happen and what ended up happening was that many narratives came together and sometimes even collided. And that was really the beauty of it. So here you have a gentleman in the black t-shirt in the middle. He is a very well-established artist, and his family is also from a long line of very wealthy textile merchants from the neighborhood. He was contributing some objects which he thought were very precious objects. In fact, he didn't give the objects; he gave only photographs of the objects to the museum, to the collection. And here we're having a community meeting where everybody who's contributing something is coming together to discuss what is being shared and why it should be in the museum or why it should not be in the museum. He's looking at photographs of objects that are going to be contributed by the gentleman to his left, who is a makeup artist and makes costumes for a kind of very popular and kind of very popular and often, very accessible, cheap form of theater called Jatra. So he's looking at this man's objects and saying, "Oh, these objects don't belong in the museum. None of these materials are, of any esteemed quality, or they are not expensive, or they're not rare. So your objects really don't belong in the museum." So that's something I think we really wanted. We wanted these exchanges to happen, and we wanted these multiple narratives to come together and to have this dialogue across, between people who ordinarily don't engage with each other. And also something we wanted, and what ended up happening, is to make space for non-expert voices within this museum. And sometimes, especially the children, went and collected stories, and sometimes they didn't seem very factual, and they were almost bordered on fiction. But that was also kind of the flip side of having non-expert voices. But we still thought those stories and narratives are important, and fictions are important to include in this museum, and this imagination of what represents this neighborhood. And finally, what also ended up happening was, because these boys were suddenly given this badge and this authority and this power, you end up subverting hierarchy. So they're actually doing a little exercise and a lesson for their teachers who are on the right. So we started understanding that if you create these frameworks and you enable people to occupy them, often bringing in their own perspectives, coming from different backgrounds, there are also these beautiful moments which are sometimes temporal, but where certain hierarchies are perhaps subverted for that particular moment. And there's beauty in that, because that creates a possibility or an imagination for what can be. And these boys, they keep coming back to all our projects over the years, and there's a sense of belonging and ownership of this narrative that comes with subverting these hierarchies. This is a kind of final image of the pop-up museum when it was opened out to the public, and people from outside the neighborhood also could come in and have a look at what was there and take guided tours from the students and the other contributors. And I think this is the moment when we said, okay, this museum, everything we've been wanting to do or building up to has come to fruition, because here we have a moment where there's so many different kinds of people who otherwise would have never inhabited the same space, truly creating a public space where where of encounters. And for that particular moment, kind of having a kind of exchange or a process of reflection or process of sharing that is unusual, unfamiliar, sometimes even uncomfortable for all the people involved. And that, I think, we thought always presents new possibilities of what this neighborhood could be, what the community could be, what people's stories and their own narratives that they tell themselves could be. So that's something I think we then learned from this project, and tried to take forward through the subsequent years through the work we do at Hamdasti. So Hamdasti was actually an idea that was started while I was at GSD, and I had applied for the Dean's Cultural Entrepreneurship Fellowship, and that's where I had sort of incubated it in my head. And over the last 6 years, we worked with 15 artists and slowly expanded this network of community collaborators, from the students to the artisans and craftspeople, their teachers, residents, police people in the community, and facilitated these kind of community events or encounters, and also creating space for sharing through open houses, festivals, etc. But overall, the idea is to really imagine what could happen if artists could engage with community spaces and work collaboratively as co-curators, co-facilitators, to create spaces for these encounters. This was a project that I then worked on with Divya, actually, just before she came to the GSD. And this was maybe the version 3.0 of the pop-up museum, where the entire neighborhood, we created a trail, and at every point on the trail, somebody who lived there or worked there develop their own encounter or their own offering or their own interaction, whether it was a workshop to learn how to make these wooden molds, or whether it was a demonstration of how to create jewelry, or whether an old bookshop in the neighborhood set up an exhibition outside that you can come and sort of interact with their old blocks and plates. So this was really a point where initially we had to do a lot of the work in engaging people and getting them to think about what will they show, what will they share. But this was a point where, again, the framework of this trail became a space that people could come and populate, and most of them had been working with us for a while now. So they had that, the openness and the ideas, and they came to the space with those ideas. So it was, again, a moment where we felt like we had come a long way from the pop-up museum that we had begun with. Cut to 2020, and suddenly the city has a new art museum. This is the building in which it's housed in. The city and the region had never had an art museum before. I never thought that I would associate myself, there ever be such a space or such an institution within the city. And even while working at Hamdasti, we had often wondered what would happen if there was a museum in the city. What kind of space could it create for artists? What kind of space could it create to support such practices as what we were trying to do? and we really kind of missed it in some ways. So when a new museum was set up, and I was in, it was almost like a gift that was given to me and to my team to say, okay, now do something with it. What can you do with it? The museum, the exhibition had already been curated, the collection had already been put together, but the space was opened up to us. Um, the museum came with its own baggage. Most museums in India are public institutions owned by the government and have a colonial legacy. So, as history museums set up before independence, they are housed in a building like this, which is a neoclassical building here in an Italian style, and that kind of that facade or that architecture gives it a kind of monumentality and a legitimacy, which I guess is the reason why the museum was set up in this building. It's a part of a larger effort of reactivating some of these heritage spaces which are sort of lying crumbling in the city. What the museum is called is Ghore Baire. So in that way, I guess we try to move away. Ghore Baire means the home and the world and beyond. So it points to this idea of locating the local in the global and the exchanges that were happening in Calcutta in the early 18th century. And also, when you enter the museum, there's this courtyard, and when you look up, you see these this opening in the sky, and you see these broken arches with jagged, kind of unfinished edges. And the story is that this building was almost crumbling; it was almost being destroyed before the Archaeological Survey of India came in to restore it. And in a way, I think when you enter the facade, which sort of gives this kind of air of European colonial legitimacy, is you kind of enter and you encounter a different narrative where you encounter this ambivalent nature that we have with our colonial legacy in the city. Up till very recently, most of the colonial buildings in the city were really left to ruin. A lot of the statues that are in our public spaces had been shifted and replaced with leaders from our national movement or from local politics. And heritage buildings and heritage conservation was something which was really was something which was really ignored. And in a way, very understandably so, because we were still trying to establish what is our relationship with this colonial history. So the museum is really a beautiful testament, I think, to that, and which is why I really love the central courtyard. And the architecture of the space gave us a mandate to now and sort of examine examine our histories and examine our relationship with our heritage, and kind of speaks to this incomplete relationship that we have with our history. Another part of its kind of colonial legacy is this timeline that runs through the museum and is displayed prominently on the wall. So much of the art history began with European scholars or British scholars who decided what is art, what is not art. Thank you, Divya, for her presentation as well, because some of that would have been, and what Karen said about a lot of it being, classified as artifacts of historical interest or as crafts, and not really finding a place in the canon or finding a place in this timeline. Our timeline at the museum also begins with the arrival of the British artists and the European traveling artists in the city. And it's almost like for 100 years, there's no art that exists locally. But this is again a part of the gift that we have inherited and a part of this ambivalent history that we have inherited. And it is being contested by scholars. In fact, one of the galleries is a gallery of paintings of of early Bengal art, which follows in this lineage of the company paintings that Divya spoke about artists who are trained in miniatures traditions now picking up oil painting and creating artworks of mythological significance, but through oil and bringing in kind of Western realism or academic techniques into the artwork. So this whole gallery is anonymous. We don't know any of the artists. We don't know who they were. We don't know the provenance of most of these artworks. They're called Dutch Bengal paintings because they were found in this Dutch colony in many homes there and lying in their attics. So, but the inclusion of this gallery is a part of the work of scholars like Professor Tapati Gothakurta, who included it in her writing or rewriting of art history in India in the 90s. And including it here then really shifts in some ways the idea of what is art and what is not. But we can also acknowledge there are many exclusions. Works in textiles, which were done by women mostly, other kinds of craft-based practices, which are by caste communities that are discriminated against, don't find a place in this canon even today. Women don't find a place in this canon very often. So there is this kind of shifting and contesting idea of what is our history, who's included and who's not in the museum. So now that we had been given this gift, we had to think about how what we would do with this history and with this legacy, with this building. And Unfortunately, we didn't have too much time to test it out before we went into lockdown. So we had to shift a lot of our activities to the digital space. But on reopening, one of the first things we did was we invited students, high school students, to come and become museum ambassadors. And we left it up to them over a series of workshops to develop new ways in which visitors could engage with these artworks, and for them to come up with activities or experiences that visitors would encounter when they come into the museum space. Something we were really conscious about is to bring in students from different backgrounds. So a bunch of students came through sort of mainstream English medium schools, and another group of students came through a not-for-profit organization that was building local youth leaders, and these were all actually they were art mentors in their communities. So they came together, and again, that it in India, in anywhere we have in India and elsewhere in the world as well, we have so many uh, kind of fine dividing lines which get are put into sharp focus when different groups come together. Here, the barriers of language, barriers of different access to different levels of knowledge, all came into sort of sharp relief when these two groups came together. But that was the kind of negotiation we were determined to see through the workshops, and I think by the end of it, we managed to find the balance between all of this, I think. And you had each student group taking over one part of the library of the museum, one room, and curating an experience for the visitor. So here again, some of the lessons from our pop-up museum of privileging the non-expert voice, of creating encounters, of bringing together of bringing together multiple narratives of the same space, multiple interpretations of the same history, is something that we thought we was captured really well through this project. It was a small experiment, so of course you're always left wanting more, left wondering what more you can do and how you can take this experiment and create a program through which many more students can engage with it. And the multiple narratives is something that I think we keep then reinforcing. We keep looking at that timeline and we keep thinking, how can we curate events and programs that challenge that timeline, challenge the narratives that are embedded in the art in the museum. So this was a performance of the Mahabharata, the Indian epic, but through the lens of one of the lesser or characters, the wife of Bhishma, one of the heroes of the epic. And she tells the story from her perspective. So we're inviting artists, we're inviting people from across disciplines to come in, look at the narratives that are present in the museum. The Mahabharata features in so many different paintings in the museum, and present their own counterpoints and counter narratives to that. This is a Jamboard. This is the only way I could find to represent this very interesting process that we went through, where we invited during the lockdown students of museum history, museum studies, and art history from all over the world. We had 9 women from different parts of the world as a part of the Indian diaspora to come together, look at our collection, and curate an online exhibition around it. So this was just one of our brainstorming sessions that we were going through to figure out and really nail what will be the curatorial focus of the exhibition. So this is something we want to keep doing. And again, Karen shared some wonderful examples of how we can open up again who holds the knowledge, who holds experience, what stories are told, and from whose perspectives, by sharing multiple perspectives on the same content, on the same narrative that we have. Um, of course, there's a limitation to what we can do with this, because at the end of the day, you realize in your collection, there's so many women artists whose works are missing. There's so many Dalit artists whose works are missing, or there's no representation of queer communities. And That's something then as a museum we want to keep doing and keep adding to through engagements with families and family archives. So this was a art and feminism editathon that was organized last month at the museum, so that even though we can't add some of these women artists to the museum, we can start adding their narratives to our online platforms and start bringing their stories into the museum space as well. So this was Damayanti Lahi, the daughter of an artist called Shanu Lahi, who's entirely missing from our museum, but was a very important figure in Bengal's art. And she brought all her family photographs, and it's a small step towards doing that and looking at the exclusion. But some of these stories don't exist. Even if we look at family archives, even if we go digging in, forgotten collections, some stories are left out and will be left out just by the way in which this history has been written over the last 200 years, or where the history even begins. Projects like this, Imagining Utopias, which is run by a queer feminist collective in the city called Amra Adbhut, it was something that we really thought we wanted to support long term. And to bring into the museum space long term. And they are really then saying, we don't want anything to do with history, and let's write our own fictions and let's write our own stories. And at some point within the museum, it brings me back to the pop-up museum, where the children were coming up with all kinds of absurd stories about the neighborhood, and we didn't know whether to leave it out or to keep it in. Where as museums, maybe sometimes, since history is also written with a certain idea of what is knowledge and what knowledge is legitimate, we make room for stories and fictions as well. And that's just something that we want to think about as we go forward, because otherwise there'll be gaps which there's no way of filling really. And as we are here at this juncture where we are cutting up artworks and remixing them and coming up with our own narratives, we go back to the idea of the encounter, and what are the encounters? Are we being successful in creating the space for multiple narratives or for non-expert voices? But where are the encounters that are happening across lines and dividing lines? And so I guess there's always a search for that dividing line. What is it now? Where does it lie? How do we cross it? There's so many that come into focus, and that those lines will keep moving forward further into horizon, and you'll have to keep catching up. I think, for example, the lockdown brought the digital divide to the fore. All our events have to be pre-registered now because of COVID safety, and that immediately cuts off an entire section of the population. It cuts off our immediate neighborhood, who we otherwise would have opened up the museum to come for our programs and events. But since again you have to pre-register, it cuts them off. Also in terms of who forms the museum, is wanting to acknowledge the fact that my surname denotes that I am from a kind of an oppressor caste, so the traditionally known, what is known as the upper caste, and most of our team is like that. We are mostly non-Muslim except for the support staff. So how do we also within our groups and our teams break those, find those lines and try to cross them in some ways and try to open them up? So I think we'll always be in search of those encounters, always be in search of how we can make the museum space, the collection, a catalyst for such encounters, and keep going back to the pop-up museum to, and try and bring that back into the museum space. That's all for now. I guess I just opened up more questions and provided any answers, but that's where I am right now as well. And again, with when you're in situations like the situation we are now with COVID, we want to see just stop doing anything, because we feel like completely paralyzed, and we feel like we don't know what would be relevant at this time. And these questions keep haunting us in some ways at this time as well. So that's the state that we are at currently. Thank you so much, Divya, and thank you, Heidi, for inviting me. Thank you to all the panelists, and now over to the next presentation. Over to you.
Are we on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Really enjoying it so far, and really appreciate the opportunity to discuss these issues and to learn from colleagues old and new, especially because the Peabody Museum, which I'm here to represent, is going through a concerted phase of thinking very intentionally about our past and our history and how to move forward and become a more open and equitable institution. Before I start my presentation, I do want to just take a minute to acknowledge that Belmont, Massachusetts, where I live, as well as the lands on which the Peabody are situated, were taken from the Massachusetts Nation. I also want to recognize their continuing presence and my personal appreciation for their continuing efforts to teach us to respect the living earth and lands. The Peabody Museum is committed to developing respectful and reciprocal relationships with all the communities whose cultural heritage is reflected in the collections. So I am sharing this 20-minute slot with my colleague, Diana Loren, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We've decided to split it up, so I'm going to present a brief snapshot of Peabody history and collections and sort of some moments of change in the museum. And then Diana is going to pick that up and talk about our fairly new initiative of ethical stewardship. So let me share my screen. Did you lose me there?
Nope.
Nope, nope, you can't see me, or nope, you didn't lose me.
We did not lose you.
Okay, but all right, so the Peabody, switching gears to this more historical presentation, I think I've been thinking a lot about the issues that Heidi raised for us to think about in terms of how to reckon with the past and what decolonization means, especially with regard to curatorial practice. And I think context is important in answering those questions because museums vary so much in terms of what type they are, what their missions are, their history creates their institutional culture, and also sort of guides what is possible moving forward. So the Peabody really is kind of the quintessential 19th century colonial museum. And I think that makes it valuable as a space now to have conversations about these issues, both with descendant communities and also as a resource for students at Harvard. But it is the oldest and one of the largest anthropology museums in the US, founded in 1866, before anthropology really was a thing. Of course, it's located near ground zero for settler colonialism, but the most important context is that it's part of Harvard University, and that has strongly shaped its development and organization. And of course, in the 19th century, Harvard could certainly be described as Eurocentric and elitist, and a place that reproduced white privilege. And also Boston and Harvard have always looked to Europe. So Eurocentric is very direct here and literal for inspiration, particularly England. And you can see this reflected in the architecture of the Peabody and also its origin story. So the Peabody was founded in 1866 by George Peabody on the recommendation of his nephew, O.C. Marsh, who was a paleontologist at Yale who had visited Europe and became very excited about emerging scientific ideas, especially the concepts of prehistory, which was brand new at the time, the idea that people had a prehistory, and also evolution. Darwin had recently published on the origin of species. And he suggested to his uncle that the United States should have an institution devoted to investigating those questions in the Americas. So the Peabody was very purposefully founded to investigate the ancient cultures of the Americas, with the idea that it would contribute to broader comparative understandings of human history as a whole. And even though it later broadened its purview, that focus on archaeology has really strongly shaped what was collected, how they were collected, how the collections were interpreted, used, and valued over time. And especially because throughout most of the 20th century, or until quite recently, recent decades, the museum was directed by archaeology professors in the Department of Anthropology. So their research and teaching agendas really guided the museum. And consequently, by about 1930, the Peabody had accumulated these enormous collections, especially in archaeology, as you can see on my slide, that were systematically collected from around the world in pursuit of academic questions, really, theories in archaeology and so forth. The so-called ethnographic collections were not as systematically collected, which leads to a whole different set of issues, which we can talk about in the question phase if people are interested.
Also, real quick, I'm sorry, but we're getting requests. Is it possible for you to switch to presentation mode so we can see your slides a little bigger?
How do I do that?
If you go to view on your top, on your bar on top,
Yep.
left, on the left.
Yeah, go to the left a little on the menu. Yep.
Yeah,
A little more
yeah,
to the
there's
view.
view.
I'm sorry, what?
There's a button that says view on the left.
On the left. See, I
Oh, you just passed it. It's
not
right.
this one.
Yeah, that works too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Presenter view. Does
No,
that
slideshow view. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So sorry about that. Most of the problematic legacies of museums have to do with how collections were reframed once they are and recontextualized once they enter the museum. And Heidi has already mentioned this earlier. So this begins with cataloging systems that organizes them according to Eurocentric taxonomic categories and classifications. And I know the panel, this following panel, is going to focus on issues of data and cataloging and language problems. That's one big and obvious set of issues that we're trying now to address. And then, of course, representation is another, especially in exhibits. So up until the mid 20th century, at least, exhibits were organized by scholars and they were third-person presentations of the collections. And just to summarize, I would say for most of the Peabody's history, at least the first 100 years, the collections in the museum were primarily viewed as resources for scholars and researchers, both Harvard-based and external. And this was really reinforced by the university, which always emphasized that the museum's purpose was to contribute to the larger university mission of teaching and research. So it developed a very insular institutional culture in some ways. We were never oriented really even to public visitors. But things do change, and decolonization really began in the 60s and 70s, both politically and culturally. And this slide is a view of the opening of an exhibit in 1974, which I believe to be the first native curated first person exhibit. And it was curated by a graduate student by the name of Rosita Worrell, who is Tlingit. She got a PhD in anthropology at Harvard and is now president of the Sealaska Heritage Institute. So this was kind of a landmark on the road to change. And it makes sense that, you know, an individual student was the first person to break that ground. As Karen mentioned, I think the 1990s were a big watershed moment, and a couple of the reasons for that at the Peabody, NAGPRA, for one, passed in 1990. Repatriation had been a pressing issue already for decades by then. NAGPRA was a real catalyst because all of a sudden the Peabody was engaging with as many as 50 tribes every year, some of those sending delegations to the museum so they could see the things from their communities and they could provide input on how they wanted those to items to be handled and stored, which things should be shown and which not. And the Peabody was very receptive to that and began changing policies and procedures in ways that really began to privilege the perspectives and voices of descendant communities. The other happy circumstance for the Peabody, as the Peabody Essex had Dan Monroe, we had Ruby Watson, and Ruby was a leader that made a big difference. She was the first full-time director of the Peabody. She was the first cultural anthropologist, not a member of the department, and a woman. And she was a big proponent of repatriation. And she also believed that the collections were the cultural patrimony of the communities. And she promoted a series of collaborative and even restorative projects. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples. This slide relates to a partnership between the Alutiiq Museum and the Peabody that grew out of a NAGPRA consultation visit that identified a really important Alutiiq kayak. And so the two museums jointly applied for and received a Save America's Treasure grant that funded a multi-year project devoted to studying that kayak and related collections with the idea of restoring knowledge to the Alutiiq community. They were particularly interested in learning what items were made of, and a new scientific technique had recently developed that enabled that. And at the end of this project, the kayak was sent on long-term loan to that community. Another aspect of this project that is worth mentioning is that the lead person for the Alutiiq Museum, Sven Hawkinson, who's there on the left bottom, was another Indigenous person who received a PhD in anthropology from Harvard, and he's now a curator and professor in Washington State. So one of the ways forward is the fact that many more young Indigenous people are entering fields of anthropology, art history, and becoming interested in museums. So that's an important change. And just one other project to mention, this is a postcard view of the entrance to an exhibit that I co-curated with Lakota artist Butch Thunderhawk. It opened in 2009. It's still up for a little bit longer. This also initially was inspired by NAGPRA because Houghton Library at Harvard discovered that they had a ledger book of Plains drawings that had been collected from the Little Bighorn battlefield after the fight from a funerary lodge. And there were indications that it had belonged to a Lakota man. And so we contacted the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and ended up entering into a partnership with Standing Rock for another multi-year project that had many dimensions, of which this exhibit was just one. But I mention it because it was the first time we really tried to do an exhibit from another cultural perspective. So Butch and I wanted to do a Lakota-centric exhibit. And the way that this is another model of collaboration, because through Standing Rock, Historic Preservation Office identified community members for us to talk to about how to present this material, what the theme should be, the selection of objects, and all the decisions were made collaboratively from the beginning with this installation. We used a lot of Lakota language and concepts. And there is a section in the back with a video gallery that focuses on contemporary voices at Standing Rock related to themes developed in the exhibit. So that's another model. Partnering with an artist was very helpful, I think, because Butch was great about being able to sort of visualize ideas, but also working with the tribe. And I will say, just in closing, that projects like this take years, and I felt fortunate that the museum supported Butch and I for about 4 years as we worked towards designing this exhibit. So in closing, I think for the last couple of decades, as Karen said, we may not have called it decolonization, but the museum had really transformed our understandings of the collections in terms of coming to regard them as the cultural patrimony of the descendant communities, seeking to collaborate with them, seeking to privilege their perspectives. But we've realized recently that that really wasn't and isn't enough, because it was still really project-based and still really sort of siloed in a couple of different departments at the museum. And we realized that we want and need to address these issues in a more intentional and systematic and holistic way moving forward, and recognize our broader responsibilities, develop more enduring relationships with communities. And again, leadership matters. So the tipping point for this was change in the Harvard administration. A couple of years ago, we got a new dean in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Claudine Gay, who gets it and has made all the difference in the world. We got a new director, Jane Pickering, and Jane has made it her mission to transform institutional culture. And so I will turn this over to my colleague Diana now to talk about sort of where we're at in that process.
Hi, thanks. Sorry about that. I was muted. We wanted to thank Divya and Heidi for inviting us to be part of this discussion, the opportunity to have a conversation with our fellow panelists and the attendees. Like my other colleagues, my thoughts are with Shimona and Divya right now and their friends and family in India. And thanks, Castle, for preceding me so I can talk a little bit about what's happening now. You know, the background of the Peabody Museum is pretty varied, and it's a dense background. There's a lot of information there. And I think it's important to have that background so we can talk about where we're going now and the new changes that have been happening that Castle foreshadowed in her talk. So one thing to keep in mind with Peabody now is we're at a point where we're undergoing a lot of change. Castle mentioned the new leadership, both within the Dean of FAS, Claudine Gay, and Claudine appointed Jane Pickering as the director of the Peabody Museum in 2019. When that happened, Dean Gay had several charges for Jane and for the practice of our work at the Peabody. And I've outlined those here, and you can see them in the slide, the three here. The first, to articulate a set of principles and framework for ethical stewardship of Peabody's collections. The second was to examine the ways in which the museum collections present the opportunity to speak honestly and about history and to reflect on shared histories. And finally, to think critically about physical care and stewardship of the collections. You know, there's an urgency within museums now. We need to care and think about stewardship in different ways. So what do we need to do structurally to talk about that and do that work? So my part of the presentation is going to talk about a little bit of what we're doing and where we're heading. I want to say also that with the attention that Dean Gay has given to the Peabody Museum and the directorship of Jane Pickering, we also have support and collaboration across the institution for doing the work at the Peabody Museum. They're to help guide, practice, and promote support for the work we're doing, as well as the NAGPRA Advisory Committee to also provide support and guidance for the work that we do in NAGPRA. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as we move through. So one thing to get back to, and this is something that has been articulated in all the talks so far, is the nature of our institutional history. And this institutional history, recognizing this and being honest and transparent about this history, is the first step to being a true ethical stewardship of collections. So, what does this mean? Castle talked about it, that the legacy of settler colonialisms is embedded within the history of the Peabody Museum. It is inscribed in our practice. So colonialist and imperialist agendas drove what was collected, how collecting took place, the language used to document collections that resides in our catalogs, and also it guided the understanding and interpretation of Indigenous and heritage stakeholders' cultural material. That cannot be understated. What this means is that those legacies are found in the catalogs, in the documentation, and in the archives. That includes racist and derogatory language, as well as in past exhibits, and how cultural material was implicated in forwarding colonialist histories in teaching, and that's teaching at Harvard. So really addressing institutional history means addressing our history, both past and present, as an institution and as an institution within Harvard. And so working on this, talking about it, and being open about it is essential to our goals of ethical stewardship of cultural material in our care. So then what do I mean by ethical stewardship? And Castle talked about this too, the commitment to a holistic program of ethical stewardship of the collections. It means at this point, shifting practice and thinking about the practice that we do at all levels of the museum. So, what marks this is an intentionality of practice, an intentional response to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples and other heritage stakeholders in relationship to museum collections that are no longer under their care, but are under the care of the Peabody Museum. Again, it's acknowledging these and the different ways that cultural material came to be part of the Peabody Museum. I think, oops, sorry. There, sorry, I always flub up with my, am I right? Yes, okay. Sorry about that. I always seem to flub up with my slides in the middle of a talk. My hands are going, sorry about that. So acknowledging our histories and the different ways that cultural material came to be part of the collection. We need to do this work, right? So it's different ways that collections came to be part of the Peabody Museum and came to be part of the Harvard's institution, right? So thinking about that history also means that we're talking about shared authority for care, management, and interpretation of the collections. It means centering and privileging Indigenous voices, their knowledge and perspectives as we look at the collection and care for the collection. It means fostering relationship building, dialogues, making the museum a place for discussion and dialogue to have this work, and a place for diverse perspectives within museum spaces. And when I talk about museum spaces, I mean not only the public spaces of galleries, but I also mean behind the scenes, in storage, and offices within the museum. So, changing practice, changing ethical practice means embodying values, these values at all levels and all departments of the museum. So it's not just a core set of individuals doing this work, but rather it's the responsibility of everybody who works at the museum. That's a real shift. That's a real shift within anthropology. That's a real shift in museums. And as I mentioned before, you've heard about this. There's an urgency to this work and we need to do it. So how are we doing it? Yeah. All right. So one thing that's been happening over COVID while we've been at home is that we've constructed working groups to talk about ethical stewardship, to think about the changing practice. What does that mean on a very realistic level? I think there's a criticism at a meta level about museums need to change. Yes, they do. Not arguing with that. But what does that mean in day-to-day practice? So what does that mean for every person that works at the museum? So to guide some of these efforts, we've set up different working groups that include members of all parts of the museum to think through these issues, to think through our practice, and to think towards new ways of working and looking at the museum. So one is our ethical stewardship group. So we have guidelines for ethical stewardship. And so we have a group that works on implementation and resources. How, what internal resources do staff need to learn more about ethical stewardship and practice? What general issues are we addressing? And what about public outreach? How do we share this information outward to communities? Another part of ethical stewardship, and I know this is going to be talked about in the next section of the next panel, is collections documentation. Looking at that legacy of racist and problematic language in the database and addressing that. What do we need to do internally, looking at our catalog and bringing that information out and addressing, what is painful and traumatic within the data itself. We've also set up working groups for diversity and inclusion, thinking about how we work internally and how within the museum and how we work within Harvard. Part of this I mentioned is both external and internal. So, our website is a big part of how we communicate our work to the public. So looking critically at the website, how it's constructed, and, different issues of accessibility, I mean that in all levels, is really a concern. So kind of looking back at what we're presenting and how we're presenting information and what we need to do to collaborate to make that accessible. It also means rethinking exhibits. Castle gave some great examples of past exhibits that really forward collaboration and Indigenous and heritage stakeholder voices. We need to do more of that, right? So what does that mean for the structure of exhibits and the structure of exhibits in the building itself? So we need to address that. And finally, it means also working with our partners at Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. They're the ones that help develop exhibits, public programming, and education. How do we share these efforts with them so that we're all working towards the same goals? So in my last slide, and I'm kind of running short here, is I just wanted to highlight some current initiatives and public statements so that if you're interested in finding out more information about what we're doing, projects that we're working on, here are places to go, right? So one recently announced really great initiative is the Harvard Oceanic Collections Engagement Fellowship, which was recently announced, and the website's here. And this is a community program for adult members of Oceania and Oceanic diaspora communities to engage with the collections. So it's a really great thing. During COVID, we had plans for putting up an exhibit on the commemoration of 1620 with Wampanoag community members. COVID forestalled our ability to actually do work in the building. So we worked with community members to put together Listening to Wampanoag Voices, which is an online exhibit where community members, Wampanoag community members, speak directly to collections and reflections on their history and reactions to collections that are currently under our care. At the very beginning, Heidi mentioned the statement from President Bacow about human remains in the collection. There's an additional statement from the Peabody Museum Director, Jane Pickering, about human remains in the collection, and an apology for scientific practice that resulted in individuals in the collections. Take a look at that, right? Associated with that is an announcement regarding associated funerary objects and how that the inclusion of associated funerary objects in the return of individuals with NAGPRA collections. Phil DeLoria, who's a member of our faculty executive committee, also gave a wonderful Q&A in the Gazette that talks about the work of NAGPRA and the emotional labor that goes into doing the work of repatriation on various levels. So please take a look at those efforts. And then finally, my dear colleague, Castle, also organized and ran 2 panel discussions that are available on YouTube called Reimagining Museums, where Chris Newell from the Abbey Museum, Loren Spears from the Tamaqua Museum, and Jane Pickering talked about, what are the challenges that museums are facing now, particularly in the time of COVID. There's an urgency to doing this work, to changing practice. There's a lot of things happening in the world. How do we address them now? What's happening in New England? So I invite you to take a look at those as well. And that's it. Thank you for your time and welcome any questions.
Well, thank you so much. Incredible presentations from everyone. I'm sincerely grateful for everyone's attendance and learning about your practice and the work that's happening in your fields. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed and learned so much during this time. So without further ado, we do have a few questions from our audience and also from students at the Institute of American Indian Arts. I'm assuming are in the Museum Studies program there, which we'd like to bring into this conversation. One question that's in the chat function, which by the way, everyone is welcome to include any questions or comments you might have for our panelists. So the first question I see is from Mario Caro, who is actually the current director of IAIA, or the Institute of American Indian Arts master's program and Master of Fine Arts program. And his comment first is that it's great to see all the excellent work that has been going on at the Peabody for some time. It's really wonderful to see these presentations all at once. However, retroactively calling the good work you've been doing for some time as, quote, decolonizing the museum undermines the recent activist work that has come from outside of the museum under that banner. How would you differentiate the work you've been doing within the institution from the critical work that comes from outside?
I'm happy to start answering. I know Castle wanted to jump in. Thank you for that question, Mario. I think it's important to understand, in what I was talking about, both the intentionality of current practice in relationship to contemporary critique. That's extremely important, right? That the change is happening because of critique and needs to happen because of critique. I do think that decolonization work has happened in the museum over time, and Castle gave some examples. But I think new work has a different flavor, and the practice of the museum itself, thinking about that as a change happening in all aspects of museum work, not just exhibits, but thinking about it in terms of collections work, publications, conservation. It's a shared concern among Peabody staff. I don't know if Castle wants to add on to that.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that because I'm the oldest person on the panel, I have a longer term perspective on that. So I lived through the activism of especially the 70s and the 80s with regard to repatriation. And I'm also an anthropologist, so I think anthropologists began responding to that during the 70s and 80s too, becoming a lot more reflexive about the discipline and the discipline's history and trying to improve. I think a lot of people look at NAGPRA as sort of the starting point of things, but I see it as being the culmination of a couple of decades of really important activism, mainly by Indigenous Native Americans, but also by some of their non-Indian allies. But it's interesting that it takes a couple of generations of waves of change before things seem to reach a tipping point where everything aligns so that there's a broader social recognition of the issues, not just within disciplines and communities, and a new level of change can take place. So I think it's a joint process of learning, and on, you know, I guess internally and externally, or native and non-native over time, that builds a momentum. And I just, again, think that leadership is critical, having the right people in place to make things happen. Karen, did you have thoughts on that?
Well, the sister Peabody, I just would say that I think that rather than thinking of these of quote unquote decolonization and external activism as separate from what is happening in museums and as in opposition, I would just say that that it's wonderful fuel for those of us working within the museum. And I would also just call attention to the fact that for many people, decolonization includes land back. And so that adds another layer of complexity to the idea that decolonization is possible within a museum institution. But other than that, I think you both covered it great. Thanks. Heidi, are there other questions in the chat, or?
There are actually. So there's another chat question from Capena Baptista. And it says, it's really asking, apologies if I missed a conversation about it, but could Castle, and I'm assuming any representation from our panelists today, respond to the recent letter by the Association of American Indian Affairs about the Peabody failing to fulfill its legal obligations under NAGPRA. The letter had a number of very important points. So I'd like to hear about how the museum is responding. And I think to add to that question, I mean, because I think you may have touched upon it just a bit, and I think some of the links that you had provided in your presentation might also give sort of an official quote unquote response to that particular letter. But I think as museum professionals who are sort of grappling with this issue, especially under the umbrella of Harvard, it'd be interesting to hear, you know, in an ideal situation, how maybe you might understand the institution expediting or moving through these processes, maybe in faster ways, and what would that look like? And I guess any other additional comments you might have on that specific questions.
Sure, and thank you for asking that question, Capena. I think some of the statements that I had in my last slide, the Q&A from Phil Deloria, who's a member of our faculty executive committee, the statement from Dean Jane Pickering, address some of the issues under that was in response to the recent letter from AIAI. But I do think, you know, one thing that we're thinking about is the resources that it takes to do this work. You know, having a core set of individuals within the museum have been working incredibly hard on repatriation efforts for the last 30 years, doing really great emotional labor on behalf of the institution. And I mean Harvard as the institution, working with different communities to forward repatriation efforts at the Peabody Museum. I think it takes time, but I think that what you're seeing in the various statements is the willingness to do that work with openness and honesty. I don't know if anybody else. wanted to add to that.
I just would say, add to that, I think Phil spoke to this in his Q&A in the Gazette, but I don't think it's the case that the Peabody was ever not in compliance. For much of the time I've been at the Peabody, they've been leaders in repatriation. I think it has to do with a distinction between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And I don't want to say too much because I don't work in repatriation. We have a whole department for that. But I will just say that Harvard is very legalistic. And you know, that plays into decisions about implementation, but every staff member that I've worked with there for the last 20 some years has been very supportive of repatriation and hoping to contribute in any way that they can to see that that happens. So, you know, there are issues about NAGPRA relating to federally recognized tribes, which, you know, it's a very complex and fraught situation. So I guess maybe it's best if I just end it there, but I just want to assure people that people at the Peabody try very hard and have good hearts and want to further repatriation and have for as long as I've been there. That doesn't mean they're going to please everybody all the time. And I think Phil speaks to that and to some of the complexities that get in the way.
Thank you for your response. I just want to get to some of the questions from the Institute of American Indian Artists. And I think Shumona and Karen also might want to speak to this question. What does the idea of decolonial curatorial practice look like, and how can it work across all museums? And I wanted to add another part to it, which is how does one develop programming that transcends socioeconomic and racial barriers? And I think you could even speak to some of the issues you face in trying to achieve these things.
That's, I guess, the question we've been trying to sort of unpack and work our way around over this last 1.5 hours. Decolonial post-colonial or decolonial curatorial practice. I mean, for us, you know, it often starts with just the language that we use, the fact that it's English, the fact that it's spoken in a certain way, in a non-accented English, in a way that is grammatically correct. That's how we recognize knowledge. That's how we recognize curation. I have that privilege to be able to do that and to be able to code switch and to be able to, you know, speak in a certain way. And a lot of people don't. And that becomes a first barrier. Even in terms of the language and how we speak about, say, art, it's often compared, okay, this work is Picasso-esque or like Chagall. I mean, so that the way we sort of, the references that we use and the knowledge that is legitimate that we have to then cross-reference ourselves with in order to sort of be legitimate. So what is legitimate? Who is legitimate is something which I think will need a lot of our own unlearning as curators, as people who've been through a colonial education system or an inherited colonial education system to unlearn in many ways. It comes up in so small ways, even who we hire. So often English becomes a barrier to who we hire or whether someone's able to write an email well and in a professional way that can work internationally. So the standards that we're working towards immediately disenfranchises a group of people, leaves out a group of people. So I think it's really a lot about unlearning our own ideas of authenticity, knowledge, legitimacy. I'm just, my experience at coming to Harvard, my art education was extremely non-theoretical, extremely practice-based. I didn't know how to write a paper. And at some level, I also sort of rejected that. And I still do that in the way I speak, in the way I try to present my ideas. So even just that, and trying to be confident in that and trying to say, okay, this is also another legitimate way of creating knowledge is something I think we can change. So I think as much as we want to try to build participation, create communities, create inclusion, unless we change what we think is knowledge, or at least open ourselves to new ideas of what we think is knowledge, I think we'll still be stuck. We'll be trying and we'll have good intentions, but we'll still be stuck. And I don't have any answers as to how to do that, because we do operate in this larger ecosystem. But I think we'll keep coming across these questions of, are we doing enough? Are we opening it up enough? So that's, I think, is something to think, just something that bothers me and I think about but have no answers for yet.
I love that. I think that a decolonial curatorial practice also involves thinking a bit differently about the objects that we house in our museums, and thinking about them as not only living beings and manifestations of an artist's embodied views, but also thinking in terms of co-stewardship, especially for objects that are going to be on view, and thinking about even that co-stewardship idea and how that can be translated into the kinds of interpretation that that happens through exhibitions and scholarship. I think that also kind of speaks to what Shimona was talking about in terms of language. And I think that museums need to start figuring out more ways to have bilingual, trilingual, et cetera, languages available. Hearts of Our People, the exhibition that Jill Albergio and Terry Greaves co-curated through the Minneapolis Institute of Art, did an amazing job with multilingual labels and outreach to community members for their artwork. I know that one of our Native Hawaiian objects, our Kanaka Maoli temple image that we have of Ku, is in Native Hawaiian as well as English, and it really doesn't matter how many people from the Kanaka Maoli community come and see Ku, but it's important, even if one person comes, that they see themselves in the labels. And if that means creating more physical space to do that, then we need to come up with some more creative solutions, I think. So I think a decolonial curatorial practice across museum institutions is really, it's a great question, and it's a really hard one to answer, because not every institution is the same, and not every institution has the same kind of funding structures and staffing. But I do think that there are some values that can be applied across institutions. So I don't know that there's more that I can say about that right now. I think I'd need to give that a little bit more thought as far as what some of those, if I were to articulate 5 of those values beyond what we've already talked about. But I think that's where I'll end that. Thanks.
I think language. Oh, sorry, Heidi.
No, by all means.
I think what you're talking about language and exhibits and privileging language is something that museums have been talking about, at least in the States, quite recently. And I know that there's a discussion, what you were talking about, Karen, is how do you allow for enough space, like visual space, so that you can privilege Indigenous or stakeholder language so that someone can see themselves in a museum space. And so part of it is the design issue as well, that for museums haven't traditionally thought about that. So it means kind of rethinking the scope of our design to allow for different language and privileging language. the exhibit that Castle talked about, Wiokapiata, that's a Lakota term. And so that's the name of the exhibit, which I think, isn't often the case where you have an Indigenous term as the title of an exhibit in an American institution.
I will just add to that. For me, the heart of it is honoring different epistemologies and sharing authority over how objects are, considered, how they're as beings and how they're used in exhibits. But it's a complicated thing. It's also challenging for museums like the Peabody that have things from all over the world. So from probably thousands of different communities. And how do you honor all of them? In terms of Wiokapiata, I just wanted to add that when we proposed that, back in the mid 2000s, there was some discussion because, museums have different departments that kind of have different responsibilities and duties and perspectives. And there was some opposition because, like from a PR standpoint, people thought, the idea was good, but how is the public going to receive that? Nobody knows what that word means. It's going to confuse people if we put that on advertising or whatever. So it's a process.
Thank you for your responses. I have one more question from the students that bearing in mind the diversity among Indigenous communities, are there common mistakes that non-Indigenous museum workers make in consultations and partnerships that can make Indigenous community members feel less welcome or respected, that they may not feel comfortable pointing out?
I can just start this and maybe we can volley a little bit back and forth. I think that it's important when we have Indigenous guests of any kind to acknowledge that there are ancestral remains in the building. And even if we're not going to be visiting them, it's important for me to point that out and to share how the ancestors and the ancestral remains are off limits but present in the building. And I think that establishes at least a little bit of I think people need to know that. And so that's one thing that I can share. I'm going to keep thinking.
I'll pick that up a little bit, Karen. That is very important. I think you mentioned earlier your philosophy of presencing indigeneity. That is so crucial because for obvious reasons, Indigenous people are often reticent and uncomfortable in museums. It's important to have spaces they can relate to and feel comfortable in. It's a challenge at the Peabody because we have this old building and it's, dripping with colonial vibes. It makes not only Indigenous people, but a lot of other people immediately uncomfortable. I don't know if this is I'm speaking site-specific way here. I'm not suggesting this is a generalization. I would suggest that another impediment, though, for people is often the kinds of forms they have to fill out to view collections, just sort of all these institutional protocol kinds of things that might be alien to a lot of people. I think museums are beginning to recognize all this and try to redress those issues. That's what comes to mind immediately.
Right. Just to add on to that, yeah, definitely, because when we have visitors come to the Peabody, we ask them to sign forms. And so do those forms feel like a sort of gatekeeping for people having access to collections? And so that's something that we think about as well. How are, we understand the practice behind asking for forms and asking for information, who's visiting collections, but how is that perceived externally? And so, addressing that is part of it as well.
Just a comment before I ask the next question, which is based on your input. And I think in terms of like these forms that the public have to fill out, or as part of re-engaging or with the museum collections. I myself, as a student at Harvard, I can say that last year in 2019 in the fall, when I had initially started to make museum collection visits at the Peabody, it was also incredibly difficult for me as someone who has some kind of educational background. And so I can imagine, the type of frustration and maybe even sort of feelings of discomfort from community members who lack, any type of what's recognized as a Western educational background. Another question sort of based on that same topic too, is that warning signs or warning about human remains is crucial. Are there permanent signs to that effect in your institutions?
Not at the Peabody Essex Museum, no. There's not a sign about that.
And there's no sign at the Peabody Museum at Harvard either, but we've been talking about it. We certainly have signs in some of the storage areas within the museum, not for the human remains storage, that's not accessible, but for other areas, and Heidi, maybe you experienced this, there's definitely signage within storage at the museum as well as an indication of cardinal directions for those, reflecting requests from community members who have come to the museum about what they would like to see in storage. So I guess I would say it's more behind the scenes than it is in public spaces right now, but we've been talking about it.
I guess this question goes to thinking about like working between institutions and between lines of discipline or categories. Does the Peabody borrow work from Harvard Art Museums, and how do you kind of think about that process and navigate that process?
I know that Diana has much to say about this because she's very involved with recent initiatives to, increase our collaboration with the art museums. But I just want to take this opportunity to say one of the problems with the Peabody collections, again, they're endless, but is that they basically end around 1930. And we've never had an acquisitions budget. We do acquire things through donations. And I've been able to buy some contemporary things over the years, very inexpensive things. And that's a real limitation. On the other hand, the art museum at Harvard, art historians and art museums are increasingly interested in presenting, more global approaches to art, less based on, Euro-American standards, and much more open and inclusive. And so they don't have, non-Western, well, they do have some Asian, but they're interested in working more with the Peabody historic collections, and I'll let Diana take it from there. They'd like to incorporate this into that context as art, definitely. So.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry about that. I was coughing. Yeah, our connections with the Harvard Art Museum, I think, are really growing right now. And just, we have an amazing opportunity to partner with them as collaborators in different efforts, both in ethical stewardship, but thinking towards some of what Karen was talking about with her new exhibit. You know, how do we put together exhibits that talk about multiple voices in conversation with one another? So while institutionally, you know, we've been broken up, this is, you know, Western art, this is the Peabody collection, we're looking at ways to make those linkages so there's not that artificial barrier between the institutions.
I just will add that I think many anthropology museums around the country have benefited greatly from inviting collaborations with contemporary artists who can approach the historic collections in new ways and new perspectives. And we've certainly done some of that at the Peabody. But the Peabody is still an anthropology museum. Karen Kramer's institution is interesting because they actually transformed from more of a history museum to an art museum. And those realms, you know, were, as Diana mentioned, considered very different until fairly recently. But in the last couple of decades, art historians have become more culturally conscious and interested. And I think anthropology and history museums have recognized some of the advantages of engaging with art as the force in the world. So I think there's the collapsing of those disciplinary divisions.
Thank you all for your responses to that question. We do have one more from our guests, and it says, do the institutions represented here rely on advisory boards of Indigenous folks to help them think through their decisions regarding objects in the collections, engagement with living Indigenous artists, etc.? And if so, how are these institutions addressing / navigating the extractive nature of those types of often unpaid roles? Are they moving to add more Indigenous folks to their staff ranks?
Should I jump in? I don't want to. All right. My exhibition projects, I've had many different kinds of advisory boards, if you want to call them that. We've had convenings, we've had like one-off convenings, we've had, I think it really depends on the project. And so I don't have a one model fits all type of mindset going into my exhibition projects that often include a catalog, a companion catalog. And we absolutely pay our advisors, and we also have, you know, we make sure to invite them back to the openings and send them copies of the book, and we often can pay for their travel to the openings. I mean, I think that's just sort of like basic bare minimum stuff, but I guess it's worth mentioning for anybody who's listening who may not know. And we don't have an advisory board writ large that is not relying on Indigenous people at the moment. We have Rosita Worrell is a trustee at the Peabody Essex Museum. Jennifer Himmelreich is a staff member I mentioned before. She's a former fellow. And when we also have had just recently 2 of our Native American fellows were on staff. They recently left to go to graduate school, but we need more Native people in the museum field, and we need more Native people at the Peabody Essex Museum to do the work. And our fellowship program is not focused only on curatorial work. We want educators, we need people in our merchandising departments, we need graphic designers, we need everybody. And that's like, come to our program, look in the chat. I put our website. We would love to engage in conversation with you and have you apply for our program, but we need more people of color in this field. And if we have more people of color in this field and more Indigenous voices as exhibition designers, then they're gonna all automatically know to include talking about more physical space for labels, or how are we going to address all of the kinds of inclusive expressions that we can have in a museum experience. And I know that this goes beyond an exhibition experience, but I'm just using that as a specific example. So I think that when I've had to do work on objects in our collection, whether they're on view or not, we have our fellows that I rely on a lot when they're here for long-term or in the summertime, and they're all paid. And sometimes when I need to reach out to a tribal representative to ask questions about objects, sometimes it's an initial conversation, and if it's going to turn into a longer kind of consultation, not necessarily NAGPRA related, but just in general, I think that's when you have to have a conversation, and it's a two-way conversation about compensation. So I think there's different kinds of conversations that happen, human to human, institutional representative to tribal representative, that can sometimes happen just in good faith. And I think that you have to open the conversation about compensation. So I will pass the mic.
I definitely think compensation is an important thing to talk about. Paige, you used the term, extractive nature of those relationships, and certainly that has been true. But I think there are some really great examples of collaboration. I'm thinking about Butch Thunderhawk and his work with Castle, Sven Hawkinson and his work with us on Save America's Treasures grant. So I think, looking at these projects, having an open conversation about compensation, roles, and responsibilities is really important. In terms of advisory groups, I know that we have Indigenous members of the Harvard community on both the NAGPRA advisory group and the Peabody's faculty executive committee. So like Karen was saying, with advisory groups, like, one model doesn't fit all. I think there are different advisory groups we've had over time for different projects, and they necessarily need to change because of the communities involved and the goals of each project.
I guess I would just add that in the Indian context, I guess it would be opening up similar questions around inclusion of people from Dalit backgrounds, from Muslim backgrounds, and making room in our teams, not just at the kind of, at the support level, but across the team for such roles. And even, in terms of the artists who are coming into the museum or presenting their work there or giving talks and lectures, really expanding that. And that's a huge challenge, like all the panelists before me have spoken about. And again, I think it starts with friendships and developing our own relationships, expanding our own, silos that we all operate in. So again, I think it comes from a point of unlearning, going on a personal journey as well of unlearning and breaking the silos within which you work. But yeah.
Thank you so much for all your responses. I think since we're running out of time, we might ask you all if you have anything you want to end with or any closing comments before we wrap up.
I'd just like to say thank you for attending and giving your thoughtful and insightful presentations on the work that you're doing at your respective institutions. I think that I hope that this is the beginning of more conversations and, more importantly, more work, actual tangible efforts being made, not only at your respective institutions, but nationally and around the world in terms of addressing these inequities and moving towards more just practices within the museum and academic fields. So with that, I'm incredibly grateful for your presence, and thank you all for the attendees and your thoughtful questions and participation. I'm not sure if you want to add anything more, but we do have a session happening at 3 p.m. Eastern. That'll be encompassing our conversation on provenance and data. So we invite you to join us this afternoon, and you can reuse the link that you used to get into this session for the next session as well. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Learned so much from all these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm going to keep these conversations with me for a long time and keep thinking about it. So thank you.